There's my video. I can see me now. Hopefully that means you can see me. Welcome to our presentation for March 3rd in Family Faith Formation. New month means it's a new topic, kind of a new pivot in our year. This month's focus, especially across all of our presentations, tonight's, next Wednesdays, and then the one right before Holy Week, we're going to be focusing on the expressions of, or the theological background, I guess you might say. That's probably the more accurate one. The theological basis behind Christ's presence with us even after his resurrection. There are a couple of key events in the history of the church that are needed to understand this, and we will start with the first of those tonight, the Ascension. On the first part of a two-part series on the Ascension, this one being obviously entitled Christ the Judge. More on why that is in a minute. This is our first meeting for the month, as I just outlined. Everybody is online this week. Next week, we'll have our First Communion cohort here in person, for those who are doing First Communion who are signed up to be here in person. But then from there, there's a spring break, and after spring break, then we'll have the rest of our non-First Communion families who are doing in-person stuff here in person. And holy moly, Holy Week is just around the corner. So set your calendars, be ready for that coming up sooner probably than if you're like me, sooner than you're ready for. The topics for this month, as I mentioned, are going to focus on really two key events in the history of the church that really define our understanding of how Christ acts, who Christ is in our presence in the church since his ascension, more or less. So tonight, we'll spend our focus firstly on the Ascension, particularly the why of the Ascension. What can Christ do because he has ascended that he couldn't do before? Next week, we'll kind of get to the what of the Ascension. Like, you know, in the scriptures, it says that Jesus ascended into heaven vertically, or at least that tends to get the impression that people get. Jesus ascends vertically into heaven. Does that mean he's just out there in space somewhere right now? I don't know exactly if that's true or not, but what I do know, we're going to spend some time next week unpacking the theology behind what exactly the Ascension is, especially from the perspective of like the Jewish cosmology, to better understand what exactly the Ascension represents. At the end of the month, right before Holy Week comes in, we'll hit Pentecost as one of the most defining events for the church, because it's really the birthday of the church. Before in April, we'll dive more into the church itself and what the Pentecost brought about. So again, tonight's topic, the Ascension. What I think is especially interesting about the Ascension is that it gets mentioned in the Nicene Creed, which means that because the Nicene Creed overall is largely formulated to clarify who exactly Christ is, because the Ascension is included in that, we should understand, therefore, that the Ascension is very important. It was clearly important enough to the early church fathers to be considered important to know, to understand who Christ is, right? But as it is, it's often one of those chunks of the creed we kind of just read over and we don't necessarily dive into, much less understand. I would argue the Ascension is probably one of the most misunderstood or least approached mysteries in the creed. We talk about the incarnation, we talk about the death and resurrection of Christ, but why exactly does the Ascension matter at all? So with that in mind, I'd like to get kind of a background knowledge pulse on everybody. If I asked you right now to tell me what the Ascension, that the event the Ascension is and why it's important, what would you say? We'll take 3 minutes on this one for a Pear Deck response question. Just go ahead and write anything and everything you know about the Ascension and why it might be important. Alrighty, if you said you don't know, that's just fine. No judgments here. So Christ ascended to heaven with the Father. I can blink things like that. That's cool. Higher position. Interesting. Okay. It seems like there are some good, astute, like theological examples over there. Somebody mentioned he rose into an even higher position, taking on from being just merely a human being into being a spiritual being. I'll talk about that one a little bit more next week. So interesting point for a clarification there. Stay tuned for next week. It is important because it fulfills God's covenant with us, the bridge between heaven and earth. Proof that there is heaven. Okay, so yeah, there's a lot of good here and a lot of stuff that I want to build on. Like I mentioned, I'm going to do kind of a two-part approach to the Ascension to help clarify what exactly is going on with it. Make sure my clicker does the clicker things. So this week, somebody mentioned that Christ is fulfilling and taking on a higher position by going to the Ascension. So this week, we're going to focus a little bit on that perspective of the Ascension. This week, we'll look at the Ascension from the perspective of Christ fulfilling certain roles. Next time, as some of you pointed out, that Christ is going into this hope for heaven and earth. There's this union of heaven and earth involved there. Next week, we'll look at specifically the Hebrew cosmology of the time and how Jesus is interacting with that to change heaven and earth, or to reveal something more about the nature of heaven and earth. Anyways, on to tonight. Looking at the Ascension from the perspective of certain roles that Jesus is fulfilling, I want to note that there are, especially in the Bible, two sorts of people who ascend, right? So ascending to a certain position or a certain office or authority, those being particularly the roles of the high priest and the high king, or just the king in general. So Christ was both of these things on earth. He was a priest for us. He was a king for us. He was also a number of other things. He was also a rabbi. He was a prophet. He was a healer. He was all of these things. But really, for the focus of tonight, high priest and king, because these are the two that ascend into something. And as somebody pointed out in that previous question, Christ going away from us in this bodily sense, Christ ascending into heaven, is his ascension into the fullness of these two roles as a high priest and a high king. So what exactly does a high priest and a high king do, you might ask? Well, here's that context slide. Looking at these from a biblical perspective, the biblical role of the priest is interesting because there's a lot that goes into it. But the priest, as somebody who stands out distinctively selected from the communion or the community in question, is somebody who leads God's people in worship. I mean, that's pretty obvious. I'm sitting here in my office pointing back behind me to the church. We see that every Sunday where our priests here lead the worship that we get to celebrate as a community. But also importantly, the priests were kind of like, they knew stuff. They knew a lot about the laws. They knew a lot about how to manage a healthy relationship between God and his people. And so, being people who knew a lot about how to manage that relationship in a healthy way, they had a role in maintaining and healing that relationship when it went wrong. And one of the ways that they did that so often was through offering sacrifices on behalf of the people to God. They also brought the word of God and the mind of God, God's opinion, his ideas on all these things, his truths about things to the people. And in this way, he kind of the priest stood in between the people and God as this kind of slightly set apart class. Now, being set apart is slightly dangerous, and more than slightly dangerous, because it's easy to feel that pride taking over, right? And we see this in the priests of Jesus's time, that there was a certain classism where priests were thought to be better than everyone else. They were kind of putting themselves on a pedestal and enjoying it. But part of what's so wonderful about Christ in the Christian mystery and the Christian faith is that Christ is this priest figure who is not above us, but he's in our midst. He is not one who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, as Hebrews says, but one who has been similarly tested in every way. He's experienced our lives, and yet he is also without sin, and so therefore he can enter into the presence of God and offer sacrifice on our behalf. Now, the biblical role of the king is similar in some ways to that of the priest, but also slightly different. The biblical role of the king focuses especially on the king's ability to govern. And when the king governs according to the mind of God, according to the law of God, God's pronouncements, his word, then the king governs in truth. And when the king governs according to truth, it leads to justice. It leads to a just society where all people, and this is important within the biblical context, are where all people receive what is due to them. The good receive what is due to the good, the bad receive what is due to the bad, each in the appropriate degree, because the king is governing in truth. And the king also, like the priest, stands slightly apart from his people, in between God and God's people, as a leader in covenant faithfulness. He is a role model to the people of how to live a life of faith to God and how to be a member, really, in the covenant sense, of God's family. Notice that both of these roles are intercessory roles, you could say. They're people who stand in between as a go-between between God and humans. So the priest and the king each take the best of the people and bring it to God, and they also bring what God offers to us and bring it to all of the people. Now, I'm going to zoom in for a bit on the function of the king, because it's really, really cool, and I think really important for understanding the Ascension, that a critical role of the king is to judge the people of his kingdom. And it is precisely in this function of judgment that we need to understand how Christ's role as judge of the world is going to work out. So the Ascension is intimately connected to the final judgment, I would argue. And when I say that word judgment, it's kind of loaded, kind of heavy. So before we move on, when you hear the word judgment or judge, what comes to mind? Good, bad, anything at all? Just go ahead and throw it out there. I want to see what are your presumptions and your ideas about judgment. In all cases here, it looks to me as though there's I mean, I like the actions and consequences thing. There's an if this then that kind of thing, right? To make a decision. Who are we to judge but only God? I think that's a common direction this could be taken. I'm interested that no one mentioned, for instance, like judgmentalism, as that's almost like, to be judgmental is kind of like a dirty word anymore in these lives. No one wants to be a judgmental person. But I do appreciate that people have pointed out there's like a standard to us. There's identifying the role of good and bad, and that there's some kind of standard to be reached. I think all of that is good and moving definitely in the right direction. So my goal is to help put a little bit more skin on that, and from a biblical viewpoint, based on the way that I've researched this, and I've done a lot of digging into judgment because it's a very interesting topic that can arouse a lot of different opinions in people. When you read about judgment in the Bible or instances of kingly judgment, it reads a lot less like laying blame or assigning guilt to somebody, and certainly not arbitrarily. And it seems a lot more like discernment. That was something that really fascinated me about it. It was, as somebody mentioned, it's like that there's a criteria that needs to be met, or something that needs to be found out. And we need to, it's about finding out whether our reality corresponds, or our perceptions correspond to reality. So in short, judgment, I guess, it's really about knowing the truth. It's getting to the truth of the thing and revealing good as good and evil as evil in a world where it's not necessarily clear which is which all the time. And because of judgment, then good judgment reveals the truth. And when truth is revealed, then justice can be done, and good can be rendered to good, and the consequences of evil can be rendered to evil. So in this way, judgment is really important to governance. And I've raised this especially through, and I think this is especially true and visible in the story of Kings, in this story from King Solomon's life in the early part of the Bible. So I'm looking in 1 Kings chapter 3, if you want to read this story yourself. It reads like an old detective novel in a certain sense. It's kind of cool. So here's what happens if you haven't heard this story before. King Solomon, newly ascended, sitting on his throne, he has asked God to become like the wisest guy. Give me wisdom, God, so that I can govern your people in justice. And God gives it to him. So his first test right out of the gate is that two women come before him with one child. One woman is claiming that this child is hers, and the other woman is also claiming that this child is hers. And there were no witnesses around. There's no one saw these women give birth. And so it's really just one woman's word against the other, and there's no way to establish which one is actually the true mother, which one is really, the mother to this child. Solomon looks at this situation and says, all right, get me a sword. Dramatic tension mounts as Solomon then declares, all right, we will split this baby in half if they can't disagree on it. morbid and weird as that is, the mother's responses are telling. The one mother says, sure, go ahead, hack the baby in half, sounds totally fair. The other mother says, or the other woman says, no. If the babies get split in half, let her have the baby. The baby may live. Solomon immediately looks at that second woman and says, don't kill the baby. Give this baby to her. She is clearly the mother, right? She's clearly the one who has the maternal instinct of the two of them, right? And so the baby is left alive, thank goodness, but it's also given to a mother who clearly has the motherly instinct. She's the one who's going to care for the baby, unlike the other mother who seems to show very little regard for the life of the child. Whether or not that baby was actually that woman's child, I feel like it's hard to say that this the baby made out badly from this situation. And so in the end, the baby lives. The mother gets the baby, and the other mother goes away empty-handed, having failed to deprive the other mother of her right as a mother. So in this instance, we see that Solomon has, in his judgment, sorted out one from the other. He has, using this sword, interestingly enough, split apart what is true from what is not true, what is good from what is evil. And that's the image I think we need to have in mind as we approach this famous parable about Christ's judgment in the Gospel of Matthew. We hear that this is the parable of the sheep and the goats. I'm sure you've probably heard this a number of times, and not always in a good light, from depending on who you're talking to. But Christ says in this story, when the Son of Man, that is Christ, comes in his glory and all the angels with him, he will sit upon his glorious throne, and all the nations will be assembled before him. The good and the bad, the ugly, the rich, the powerful, the beautiful, the living, the dead, everything will be assembled before him. And they, in that big cacophony, that kind of big mess, it's not necessarily, clear yet which is which. He will separate them from one from another, as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. He will place the sheep on his right and the goats on his left. It's really important to note that up until that point in time, again, sheep and goats aren't fully distinct. The sheep probably don't know they're sheep. The goats probably don't know they're goats. They're just kind of in this big mess, and no one knows what is good or bad with any total certainty. Into the midst of that situation, Christ comes like the sword in Solomon's story. Christ comes and separates them out, so that now on his right there are the sheep, those who are good, those who are just and experiencing life, and the goats on his left, those who are evil, who have done the works of evil and are experiencing the consequences of their evilness. Once they've been split onto either side, they clearly know, and all now clearly know, what is good and what is evil. We all come to know and understand ourselves in light of the truth, which can seem so blurry and obscured to us right now, but Christ's judgment acts to split and separate it so that it clarifies the situation very much. And then from there, the consequences, as we talk about, these goats will go off to eternal punishment, but the sheep, the righteous, will go off to eternal life. The natural consequences of giving each its due, giving to the good, and to the evil, the consequences of evil. So with that in mind, then we can, I bring this up to say that Christ is kind of like he is a new and perfect King Solomon, who will lay bare the truth of our lives, the true nature of our lives in his judgment. There's nothing that escapes his view. And on the one hand, that's really cool, because in the end, we get to share his heavenly perspective at the judgment. We get to see, I think this will be cool anyway, seeing all the places where my life caused good for other people, and we're looking at all that and being able to say, wow, look at all the good that God has been able to work through me. On the flip side, I will also see all the places in my life that were dark, that were dead, that were not desirable, that I don't really want to look at. And I'll be able to see them for everything they are without any way to hide or shrug off or excuse what I've done. That can be a really dark and scary place, but the good news is, and here's where it all comes back around, we don't just have an ascended high king who knows us perfectly. We also have an ascended high priest who makes a perfect offer of mercy for us. If Christ is the great king who sees our goodness and weaknesses clearly and knows us according to truth, knows us as we truly are, then he is also the great high priest. He's also the one who offers a perfect sacrifice that is sufficient to cover up for all of our weaknesses, all of our failures, and to draw us even still into communion with God. We'll face the perfect judge, the one who cannot but judge us justly, accurately, and fairly. But we will also face the perfect offer of mercy. And the beautiful thing about the Ascension is that where one goes, the other follows, right? There can be no perfect judge without a perfect offer of mercy right alongside it. And that, I think, is very encouraging. Now, in the meanwhile, here on earth, things are a little bit less clear. Things can be a little bit hazy. As St. Paul says, at present, we see indistinctly as in a mirror, by which he means that like what's good and evil, sometimes even in ourselves, is not entirely clear. It's not easy to discern in all circumstances. But then at the end, when Christ judges, we shall see and we shall know as it is face to face. At present, we only know partially, but when we get to that moment of judgment, when Christ judges us, then I will know fully who I am. I will know fully what I have done good and what I have done wrong, and I won't have to worry anymore about figuring out which is which. I shall know fully, even as I am fully known by Christ, by God, and by everyone. We'll see our guilt. Yes, indeed, we will definitely see our guilt, but we'll also see in that same motion the sufficient mercy of God that is enough to atone for that, just enough to build us up from that. And when we see that, we'll face a choice, right? I face the choice of either wallowing in all of the sadness, all of the guilt that we carry, or accepting the offer of mercy. The difference between the good and the evil is really, I would argue, also the same difference between what is living and what is dead. What is good in Scripture is what comes to life and what brings life. What is dead is what is evil and what takes life and destroys it or twists and contorts it. So really the difference between being found to be a sheep or a goat, in my estimation, is the difference between what is living and what is dead. And the beauty of our faith is that what is dead does not have to stay dead, but can be resurrected if we entrust it to Christ. You see, that question of judgment is not just something that happens at the end of time. It's also something we can experience right now. We can experience the clarity that God gives in our life to see ourselves as we truly are, and then to ask for that renewing mercy to be resurrected. And if we'll have our hearts renewed, if we will allow ourselves to be resurrected by that mercy, then our lives can be completely different. And we don't have to look at our shame and sin anymore. And we can just focus on being in communion with God, belonging to him, and walking with him into the fullness of the kingdom. So we have a high king who knows our hearts, but we also have, everywhere the high king goes, a high priest who is offering in every moment to make us new. So this Lent, I think this is a good point to bring it back to Lent, actually, is that we can pray to experience that judgment now, right? Hopefully we have not gone all our entire lives and then we're not shocked like the goats are at the end of our lives to say, oh my gosh, God, I didn't see my life as you saw it from the beginning, and so now I'm very confused at these results. Hopefully we have prayed for this and we have encountered God's judgment, his vision, his truth from an earlier on point. So this Lent, I encourage you to pray to experience that, to experience his discernment, experience his vision, to see the good and evil in you, in your life, as it actually is. And once you can see that clearly and you have God's vision, even just a small portion of that vision, ask God for the mercy and healing to raise what is dead in you to new life. It's not something we can do on our own. It's something that God has to do. God brings about resurrection. But if we entrust our hearts to him, God can turn empty tombs into gardens. I love the line from this song right now, that God can grow roses on our barren soul. And that's what Lent is all about. And that's part of the good news of the Ascension. So with that in mind, asking you to pray for that, how can I pray for you this Lent? I asked this question last week. I'll do the kind of the same procedure here. Who needs healing? Feel free to ask me to pray. I'll pray for these every morning. I've got last week's list right here on my board. So I pray with that every day. If you would like to share a prayer intention, please do now, even if you already shared one last week. And I will be sure to pray with those every day. I'll cut this slide from the class and or from the video, and I'll show the responses to everyone so that we can pray for each other. So go ahead and enter a prayer intention if you feel comfortable doing so. All right, thank you, everybody, for submitting those prayer requests. I will, again, like I said, I'll be praying with them every day. So please be assured of my prayers for you, and that you may experience the resurrection in your life, and that those you want to pray for will experience resurrection in their life this Easter, after Lent is done, after we have finished walking through this Lenten desert. And make it go. Come on, screen. There it goes. All right. So now here we are, wrapping things up. What I have, just a quick rundown of what lies ahead. March 10th, again, is our first communion group. We're really spoiled and lucky right now. Father Cliff will be with us that night to have solemn exposition and benediction with the Blessed Sacrament for parents. So that's going to be an awesome gift. Super looking forward to that. Remember, no programs on March 17th, and our cohort A and B classes are on March 24th. There are a couple folks out there who I've sent makeup information for Circle of Grace to. Please, if you haven't sent an email to me about that or checking in on your status with that, if you've completed Circle of Grace and you're distance learning or were absent in January, please do follow up with that soon. Also, if you have a kiddo preparing for First Communion and you haven't signed up for First Communion yet, please do. And let me know how many family members to expect as part of that sign up, so that we can assign you guys a big enough pew to handle everybody comfortably. That's the end of our presentation for the night. I invite you to leave any questions if you have any questions in our Pear Deck, and see you next week for the Ascension Part 2, the union of heaven and earth.